Hi, this video is a second in a series of two videos looking at the built environment and spatial organization. We introduced those concepts in the previous video and considered some models of urban-rural settlement patterns and internal spatial organization. Now we turn to some additional concepts and theories that help us understand how it is that space comes to have a logic. And part of that, we discussed in a previous video, the concept of place structuration and the way that that develops from local culture. And so, with place structuration, according to Malich et al., who developed this concept in their study of a comparative study of two California communities that showed how the local cultures led to completely different uh, characters for the communities, Santa Barbara and Ventura, California. So essentially, the built environments of cities, or rural communities even, although that was not the focus of their study, can come to reflect the local cultural traditions in the form of community character. So the built environment, the buildings we see, the facilities that exist, are going to reflect the local lifestyle. So if people have no interest in theater or plays, then you're probably not going to find a building that supports those activities. Right? So that's sort of what we're saying here. The question is, can we control this process? Now, we talked in the previous video on culture about enhancing local cultural capacity, local significance, part of that having to do with historical legacy, and so forth, giving the community a stronger cultural identity and locally unique significance and its own flavor or brand, if you want to call it that. And once that's firmed up, then we can begin to understand what the built environment should look like, in order to support that local culture. All right, so a couple of other concepts when we're thinking about patterns of social and spatial interaction are settlement space, viable space, and attractor points. Oh, sorry, that's a typo. Fixed on the fly. There we go. So settlement space, what is that? Well, that's everything. That's the entirety of if we're talking about a city, the entire footprint of the city, it's the totality of its physical space and built environment. But we as individuals will not encounter all corners of the communities we live in, even relatively small communities. You develop, patterns of mobility and movement through your community, and you're not likely to come into contact with every single corner and square foot of that community. So the part we do come into contact with is what we call the viable space. And for us, that's really the most relevant part of the community. So it might be a place where we go to work, a place where we go get a cup of coffee, a place where we go grocery shopping or buy clothes maybe. Places where we're in the habit of visiting for different activities and functions. And everything outside of that lies in the settlement space, but outside of the viable space, and therefore is less relevant to us. Attractor points are kind of the web of viable space. So all the places we just mentioned, like our place of work, place for social activity and interaction, place for shopping activities, these are attractor points. So what are the sites we're most likely to visit and revisit and come into contact with other people? Those are the attractor points. And when you're thinking about design of a city or a business district for a rural community even, you've got to think about what are the draws? What is going to bring people together? What's going to work, first of all. Not all attractor points are going to have the same draw power uh, from place to place. One size fits all models don't usually work. Things evolve and change over time. So retail stores used to be a really strong attractor point, but with the rise of e-commerce and Amazon and so forth, they've lost a lot of their ability to attract people uh, to visit them. So they kind of fall outside of the viable space. They remain in the settlement space, of the community, but fewer and fewer people find them relevant to their viable space. So what is going to replace the traditional retail store if people are no longer visiting them, right? So cultural facilities, third spaces that promote social interaction. These are the kinds of things that might still have a draw. People still like to go out to eat, so restaurant and food facilities, that could be something else to focus on. So infrastructure, that's the other piece we haven't really said much about here. And if we're going to have a successful built environment, it needs to be built on a solid infrastructure. And one of the key challenges we should note at the outset is a pattern. And the pattern is privatization that is sweeping, throughout many communities. And the story is this: that you have a lot of public infrastructure. Uh, in the United States, a lot of that infrastructure was built after the Great Depression when Franklin Roosevelt implemented the Civilian Conservation Corps and the Works Progress Administration, putting people to work, basically building out the electric grid, the road system, the park system, all kinds of infrastructure. But for a lot of communities, there's never been any investment since the 1930s when this was initially laid out. So you have aging infrastructure, and just when communities need to upgrade their infrastructure, they need to build new roads, need to upgrade the water and sewer systems, and so forth. The public financing is under pressure. And why is that? Because, of course, people want to lower their taxes. And politicians run on low tax platforms. We're not going to touch your taxes, elect me. But the problem with that is if you're not collecting revenue, you're not investing in the public infrastructure, the fiscal crisis forces communities, municipalities to basically shed a lot of their traditional public functions. And private companies move in as a replacement in many cases. A good example of that is solid waste removal. Whereas a lot of cities and municipal governments used to handle trash removal and recycling and those kinds of things, they have been able to shed those functions, allowing private companies, many of which are traded on the stock exchange, like Waste Industries, to come in and operate on behalf of a local community. Right? Problem is, a lot of times you have to pay these private companies really high subscription fees, and so basically you're lowering your taxes, but then you wind up paying more money by having to pay a really expensive trash removal bill, right? Or some communities have public Wi-Fi systems, and you might pay a little bit of tax to build the infrastructure for that, but when you pay a monthly internet bill of $80, that's a lot more than the low tax, the relatively lower rate of pay that your taxes would be able to invest in. But people don't always see that because taxes have a bad rap and private subscriptions are viewed as optional. But when you're talking about things like internet and waste removal, are they really optional? After the pandemic, a lot of people realized the internet's really an essential function. Kids going to school online needed to have internet access, and a lot of people rely on it for their jobs. So the inability to pay means that a lot of residents just simply lose the service. Now, if you can't pay your garbage bill, what do you do with your garbage? So you probably are going to dump it on the side of the road somewhere. So what we're doing then is just externalizing the problem. Right, so these are the kinds of problems we're facing in terms of privatization. So a lot of communities are dealing with a lack of services, and rural communities in particular are challenged by physical space itself. The remote and dispersed settlement patterns make it nearly impossible to have like a water district. Just the amount of pipes you'd have to lay to hook up just a handful of houses doesn't warrant the cost, so those people are forced to rely on wells. So private wells, private septic systems for their sewage, and that kind of thing, uh, which may work fine, but it means that people have to pay really high costs to have their own infrastructure at the household level. And if you've ever had a septic tank leak, and had to pay to repair that, you'll know that that's really expensive, in the order of maybe $30,000 to $40,000, which can bankrupt a household. So those are really risky kind of investments for a household that people in a community with a better infrastructure don't have to risk. And of course, internet. A lot of the private companies have not gone to rural communities because it's less profitable. And really, profit is what drives the private investment. And if infrastructure is private, then it's profit driven. And rural communities are not viewed as a real moneymaker. So they just simply lack investment. Right? So the transportation's another element of this. A lot of rural communities simply don't have bus systems or train. Um, Interestingly, locally where I live, there used to be a fairly well-established rail system, light rail, so people could take a trolley to neighboring communities. Now there might be one bus trip to those communities, and if you miss it, you're going to have to take a really expensive taxi ride. So people wind up relying mostly on their private automobiles. Once again, if you're low income, having to pay a loan off to buy a car, pay for the private insurance bills, pay for the gas, pay for the tires, the brakes, the upkeep for the vehicle. It's all very expensive. So we're just shoving those costs down to the household level. So when we're thinking about urban rural regional planning, uh, the von Thunen model we previously reviewed in the prior video, it gave us sort of the idealized layout for what that might look like. Is that realistic? Well, maybe. If we decided to build it, we could. But our existing community is likely to become totally self-sufficient. That's probably not going to happen. Usually, it's only planned communities that are able to achieve that goal entirely. But that requires a commitment to a particular lifestyle, because we're used to having a lot of products that depend on global trade. Something we'll be discussing in a future video. Um, sprawling residential settlements. These patterns are devouring the capacity for rural production. Uh, so the lack of rationale and logic for rural settlement is actually harming urban rural regional, at least the capacity for self-sufficiency. Uh, so the goal should be towards denser nucleation, linear patterns maybe, but keeping essentially a lot of the population in the city itself, allowing the sparse and remote rural settlement pattern to exist without any pressures, so that rural functions can continue. Right, so part of that means not favoring the car, but a lot of cities, as we saw in the case of Raleigh, North Carolina, as an example, are really building themselves to be navigable by automobile. So it's very sprawling. The beltway settlement pattern is very common. It's not unique to Raleigh by any stretch of the imagination. It's very typical now of most cities, especially those that have seen most of their development after the rise of suburbanization in the 1950s. But cities that favor cars tend to be less dense, and if you have less density, you have a little more dead zones, right? So they become very unattractive to pedestrian foot traffic, and nobody wants to walk across a sprawling parking lot that might be 10 acres in size. Right? That just feels tiring and pointless. But cities, in their efforts to appeal to commuters, are allowing large parking lots to be installed. So it's something to consider, which is kind of counterintuitive because a lot of people think the way you build a city is by having more parking lots, but actually that can be the kiss of death. So the goal of increased energy and food sovereignty, if that's tied to broader sustainability goals. We'll talk more about those in a future video again. We mentioned it earlier in our discussions of environmental demography. But this requires, if we're going to have large populations, that these populations remain confined to a smaller area, right? So dense development in urban areas It's going to limit sprawl and allow rural functions to prevail. Rural areas facing less population pressure can focus on what they do best, take advantage of the natural energy resources that exist, right, and also allow some environmental protection. So we're not losing uh, important habitats to suburban sprawl, basically, or exurban sprawl. So it should be something, this is more common in Europe, policies that favor rural land preservation should be considered. A lot of rural communities in Europe have strong land preservation policies protecting them from developers. So, they can't just move in and build a huge sprawling rural or suburban neighborhood. All right, so that's going to do it. That wraps up our discussion of the built environment and spatial organization. Thank you.